Yeah, hi everyone.
All right, let's get this show on the road. What do you say? Let me get my agenda here. Okay, is this it? Oh no, those are the minutes. Okay, I would like to call this meeting to order, the Equitable Housing Strategies Subcommittee. It is 1:03 on January 21st, 2025. The Equitable Housing Strategy Subcommittee meeting has now commenced. It is January 21st, 2025 at 1:03 p.m. This meeting is being held virtually due to COVID-19 to allow for social distancing and protect the public health. As we continue our efforts in meeting remotely, we ask all commissioners and guests to mute yourselves until called upon to speak to avoid feedback and background noise. For those who have dialed in using the call-in number, to unmute to speak, dial *6 on your phone. Also, prior to speaking, please announce who you are to identify yourself. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded. We ask that you only use the chat function to request to speak or to announce that you are leaving the meeting so that we can track quorum. Also, to comply with the state open meeting law, attendance and votes will be done by way of roll call using audio, not by using the chat function. I will now do the roll call. Lori Meserbo, absent. Vicky Cusino, absent. Kenny Wong,
Here.
Ray Winch.
Here.
All right, y'all, we've got a quorum. Next on the agenda is the approval of the December 2024 minutes. Are there any changes that need to be made, any updates, edits, etc.? If not, well, let me just pause there. Any changes that need to be made? All right, hearing none, the December 2024 meeting minutes are approved. The next item on the agenda is the City of Tucson Office of Equity update. And I don't believe that there is anybody from the Office of Equity. Is there anybody else from the city that is here to give an update about that? I don't think there is. Okay, seeing shaking heads. Number 5 on the agenda, City of Tucson HCD update. Plan Tucson presentation, Plan Tucson team presentation and feedback. I'm assuming that's by you, Dan.
Yeah, that would be me. So yeah, Cesar has sent me to talk a little bit about Plan Tucson, but also about the community corridors tool as well. So I can do Plan Tucson first and then jump into corridors right after that if that works okay for you guys.
Perfect.
All right, sounds good. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, great. Well, thanks for having us. Really appreciate it. We are kind of moving into the phase 3 of the Plan Tucson effort and are doing a kind of broad kind of outreach to different committees, subcommittees, etc. So I believe Nick Martell presented to the larger commission probably about a week or two ago, and I'm gonna kind of do similar presentation, but here to answer any questions, take any feedback, and just kind of let you know kind of where we're at in the process and where we're going from here.
Hey, Dan.
Related. Yeah.
Before you get started, is there anything in particular that you would like us to give feedback on, just to like kind of tune us in a little bit more, or are you just looking for kind of anything that jumps out at us?
In reality, I think the most important thing, and I have some kind of general slides related to Plan Tucson, but if you are if you've probably already seen that in the larger commission or meeting, we can kind of skip just to the stuff related to housing, which is really goal 5. So we can do that if that works best for you.
Kenny and Ray, does that work for y'all?
I'm all right with that.
Yeah, and we have access to the full slideshow, right?
Yep, most definitely. I'll share it after we're done.
Perfect,
Okay.
thank you.
Cool. Great, Dan.
Yep. Oh yeah. So essentially right now we're going through, we released the full draft in December. We're bringing it around to get feedback really on the goals and policies from different groups that this really relates to. So of the, and I'll go back one slide real quickly. So in the plan in chapter 3, which is related to the goals, values, and policies of Plan Tucson, there are 14 goals for the plan. And while probably there's some overlap in different ones, the one that's most applicable really to the Commission on Equitable Housing, as well as this subcommittee, is goal number 5, which is expand affordable and accessible housing options. So in the development of this, we've really kind of brought in both different departments, but we've also had kind of a working group meetings specifically related to housing. So we've included housing and community development, Office of Equity, the Community Safety, Health and Wellness program, which I think is like an acronym for CASHU, which always cracks me up. And then Planning and Development Services. And we've really looked at, policy focuses of affordable and diverse housing options, housing accessibility and stability, home ownership support, collaborative housing development, neighborhood preservation, and then anti-displacement measures. And really those have provided the basis for all of the policies within Goal 5. This is just kind of an example of what we've provided as far as kind of the narrative that leads into that goal. So every goal that's in the plan has a narrative that really starts it off. And this really talks about the current state of housing, both nationally, but also in the city of Tucson. So it talks, nationally, cost of housing has risen substantially over the last few years, as the availability and affordability of new homes and apartments alike have gone down. And then it talks about Tucson, and then some of the kind of data related to that. Rents and housing prices increased over 60% between 2019 and 2023. And then really the supply of homes, and talk specifically to that. We also have some additional data that I'm going to talk a little bit about in the CCT that I think will make its way into the next draft. This is related to the housing needs assessment that we had done for House Bill 1162, which we may or may not, I'm not sure if a couple people from HCD have presented to that to the group, but you may have seen either the county-wide version or the city version, but some of that data will also be a part of this as we move forward.
Hey, Dan, do you mind if we jump in while you're presenting, or do you want us to wait until the end?
No, please jump in. This is intended to be collaborative, so yeah.
So one of the things that jumps out to me that I guess I'm wanting some clarification on is, what do you mean, or what does the report mean by accessible housing options?
Yeah, so I think what we're trying to do here is differentiate between like the capital A affordable housing, the subsidized affordable housing, and then just being able to have access to housing that you can afford. And so so ultimately it's like, I mean, there's the whole idea of what 30% of your income or less should go to housing. So making sure that people have those options in the city of Tucson for housing.
So you're basically talking about then like what I guess I would think of as like naturally occurring affordable housing, or market produced housing that lots of people can basically afford in one way or another.
Yeah, it's like matching up people's incomes with their needs and making sure that there are available options for them in that. Yeah.
The reason that I'm asking that is because from my perspective, from a fair housing lens, when I see accessible housing, I think accessible for persons with disabilities. So
Good point.
I don't think that's clear. And I would consider clarifying that.
Yeah, that's maybe with something like I don't know, attainable. We've used attainable in the past. Maybe that's a little more clear, but it's not super clear either. That's something we
Okay.
maybe need to look at.
Again, I'm just thinking out loud here. I haven't put a lot of thought into this, but one of the things that I think about in just this whole conversation about affordable housing is when I think of affordable housing, I think of housing that is being assisted by subsidy of some sort, by
Yeah.
government of some sort. All the rest of the housing is market rate housing or housing that the market has produced on its own. And
Mhm.
so, I don't know exactly how to phrase this and it to capture that, but like, I just think it's really important that particularly in this housing crisis, that we emphasize that what is going on by and large, the vast majority of housing is market rate or built by the market and is not really affordable housing. So, I don't know if there could be some terminology in terms of like, market rate. I mean, again, I think that doesn't quite capture it, but I just think that people don't understand that, and this is my opinion, I think the reason we're in this predicament is because we essentially only rely on the market for housing. And I think that needs to be more explicit in kind of the way that we talk about it and approach it. And, so just my 2 cents off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jay. I appreciate that. And I think it's interesting because if you talk about market rate housing, I think what we need to do is somehow tie the market rate housing with the actual purchasing power or the wages of people. And what's happened is they've almost become decoupled in the last, 5 to 10 years to where, previously, people's wages would have the availability of market rate housing. And it seems like the market rate housing has become so expensive that you no longer can actually afford to buy it. So maybe it's talking through that and a narrative or something of that sort, or also even in Plan Tucson, maybe having like little like kind of I don't know, boxes or whatever that clarify some of those terms that we're using to make
Yeah.
sure that it's really clear to those that are reading it and reading through the policies.
Yeah. And again, this is kind of in the weeds. I don't know if it's really that appropriate here, but the other thing that doesn't match anymore, in my opinion, are demographics. The demographics have changed so substantially. I think there's still this idea that, when people think of housing, people are thinking of families, like traditional
Yeah.
families. And like, the traditional family of having two parents or even one parent and some kids is just not accurate anymore. The number of single family households is so dramatically increased now. And I think that's another big problem. It doesn't, the single family housing that, can still kind of be built in some areas of Tucson, just like really doesn't match up with the demographics. So again, it's kind of getting in the weeds. I don't know if that's really appropriate for here, but it's just part of my observation.
But all in all, I think it is a part of this conversation because if all our, and this talks a little more to the CCT stuff that I'll talk to here in a second. If the only thing that our zoning code produces are single family homes and then maybe some apartments in the downtown area, we're missing, like, the actual housing needs aren't being met of a large portion of the city. And part of that's because of demographic changes. But a lot of it's, even beyond that. So yeah, no, I think that's helpful and something that need to make sure that we're addressing both in Plan Tucson and the CCT.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you say
Yeah.
what the CCT is?
Yeah, sorry. It's the community corridors tool. And I was trying to go back and forth on whether or not I was going to do that first or this first. Essentially, it's kind of zoning reform for our arterials and collectors, to allow pretty much for a different development type. So most of our zoning code right now is very auto-centric, and has a lot of kind of I guess constraints and barriers to getting kind of that market rate development and housing development. So it's zoning reform in order to kind of both loosen up some of our standards related to building height, density caps, building setbacks, but then shift the form to be more walkable, transit oriented kind of type of development. So we've been working on it for almost 2 years now. It's currently being reviewed by the Planning Commission. But I think that what it does is what it's trying to do is to kind of implement some of that zoning reform that I think is needed in order to start to address some of those kind of housing needs in the city that just aren't occurring, that we're seeing occur elsewhere where they've actually gone through and done this type of thing.
And that's in the specific areas of the community corridors, like that's an overlay district.
It's like it functions similar to an overlay, but it basically it's like a criteria based tool. If you have frontage on a collector or arterial and you're in a certain type of zone, which is basically R3 or more intense, you would be allowed for up to 1 or 2 additional stories of building height. You would be allowed to kind of basically justify your parking through a parking statement, and then you would get reduced setbacks. And in exchange, you have to do all this other stuff that hopefully provides more benefit to the community. Things like additional landscaping, shade, open space, as well as bringing the form to the front of the street to try to help with like human scale, that type of thing. But it's not quite an overlay because it's not specific. It's not like mapped to a specific geography. Yeah, so it's kind of like that.
Thanks. It's mapped to a specific criteria
Yeah.
that you could probably make a map of, but it's not.
So we've made a map, but it's not like absolutely specific. So like there's a what do you say, like there's a little bit of a kind of a warning on there that basically says this gives you an understanding of what it looks like, but everyone is kind of judged based on each individual site. So because it's based on like internal access, it's really hard to map specifically for it, but it gives you an understanding at least. Great. I'll move to the next slide on Plan Tucson stuff. So there's an implementation spotlight that we have for each of these goals that links to kind of functional plans that are related to it. So there is a write-up on both the HAST and the P-CHIP plan, which a lot of that kind of, a lot of the policies that we have within this plan are kind of based off of what we've learned from those plans. So this is kind of an example of some of the housing policies that are in Plan Tucson. Things like Housing Policy 1, increase public and private investment to develop and maintain affordable housing types that meet the needs of all ages, incomes, and abilities. Enable and encourage mixed income residential and mixed use development, promote abundant housing and varying levels of density and access to multiple transit options. So you'll see a lot of the stuff that we're trying to do with our zoning reform is kind of built upon a lot of what we've heard through both Plan Tucson, but also policies that we've had in place for the last 10 plus years. Number 3 is really related to zoning code changes, encourage changes to the development code to allow for more diversity of neighborhood scale housing across the city. such as not limited to casitas, tiny homes, quadplexes, and townhomes. Support investment in subsidized housing, then provide efficient and effective systems of services based on evidence, data, best practices, to equitably respond to the community's housing needs, and reduce the number of foreclosures and evictions. So a lot of these came out of our working groups, and are also based on those plans. I think, I could read through all of these to you, but I think what we're looking at is does this kind of cover generally what you would expect from, again, a general plan that's supposed to be very kind of high level, and give you enough, I guess, policy direction to really create implementation steps, but also create more specific policies in some of our other plans from mayor and council.
Could you zoom in a little bit?
Wonder if there's a way to do that. Let me try something here. I'm gonna just do this. Oh, my screen share stopped. That's not helpful. Hold on one second. Oh, no, didn't work. Okay. This may help. Let's see. Okay, is that any better? I think the yeah, it's a little pixelated.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So ultimately, this is these are the policies that we have related to housing. Obviously, there's more specific kind of policies in those functional plans that we talked about with PCHIP and HAST. But I think what we're looking for right now is just, feedback from the community on things that if we missed something, if there are adjustments in language or anything of that sort, you could do so. And what we have right now, we have surveys open that you can go in and provide any of that feedback to us. So I know it's a little on the spot trying to do it now, but if you do kind of after we send the slides back out and take a look at it, have any additional changes, please do, let us know kind of what those may be. I'm gonna try to share my screen again. Oh, stop the share, hold on. Okay. Here we go. I know it's a little small still, but that's that. We do have the only other kind of thing related to housing, I think, is just kind of our future growth scenario mapping that we have in the plan as well. That also kind of just shows, where we anticipate development and the intensity of development in the city of Tucson. And so chapter 4, which is related to future growth, this really has a handful of different things. It has some population growth and land use patterns, and is built off of really our needs as a community for both population increase, but also projections related to housing units that we might need. And the goal here really is to really guide that development in certain ways to certain areas. The biggest thing here really is the future growth scenario map, and that's this. It provides the location and general description of the types of development that may be supported in each location. It depicts citywide development patterns that can accommodate our needs and furthers its values. And it has the guidelines that go along with it. So basically what happens is anytime there's a rezoning or a proposal to change the zone, it can either be to like like a office zone to a commercial zone, or it could potentially be our planned area developments, which is a little more flexible zoning that's more site specific. They look at this map, they figure out what building block it's in. So if you look over here, there's these building blocks like business centers, downtown industrial areas, mixed use activity center, which is the most intense one, mixed use corridor, and then neighborhood centers, which are generally less intense, that really are really intended to serve more of the local kind of areas. We look at that, and then we look at the design guidelines to really get an understanding of whether it conforms with that. If it doesn't, it would require a plan amendment, or they'd have to revise their proposal to make sure that it does match that. And so this is built off of a 2013 plan. So we started with that, and then we made adjustments based off of outreach that we had done over the last year and a half. And this kind of shows what it is. A lot of the change or future growth that we're looking at is really along our corridors. And as in the city of Tucson, a lot of areas are already kind of built out in existing neighborhoods. So you'll see that similar pattern, which is reflective of really all of our land use planning to date, that's in this.
So Dan, I have a question about this. Obviously there has been lots of talk about zoning and the need to, essentially change the zoning to allow for, at the very least, more multifamily housing to be built in the city of Tucson. Does this capture what has been and up to now? And does it capture any of that kind of future thinking about how zoning is being updated and will be updated, hopefully, to accommodate that kind of growth?
Yeah, Jay, so that's interesting because we had this conversation to where, so we built this model in Arc Urban as far as to try to test it and understand our build out scenarios. And what we ended up doing was we have basically 3 different things that we looked at. One is, what is just existing by right development? What are we getting with existing by right development? And then we basically ran the model with, let's say we have a similar kind of intensity, a similar amount of rezonings over the next 10 years. What will that provide for us? And that gets us part of the way. But then we start to look at, that additional portion. How do we fill that gap between what we're getting now from rezonings and from by right development? And that's really our zoning reform. And so we built in a certain portion related to zoning reform, again, for corridors, but then also we're going to be looking at middle housing stuff as well in the future, and where we can get. And we think that will help us to get there. It's a huge amount of housing that we need in the city. And if you look at our development patterns, so I think the need over the next 10 years from our housing needs assessment was like 35,000 units. And we're producing not even 2,000 units a year right now. So in order to keep up with that future need and to build and to actually just meet our current need, we're really going to have to make those zoning reforms and make those changes in order to meet that. So it's a little concerning when you look at some of those numbers, but that's the way we kind of got to our projections. We'll have a more robust set of figures when we release our next draft in the next month or so.
That makes sense. I guess the comment I would have, and again, not being super familiar with the document as it is, one of the things that has been very striking to me over the past several CEHD meetings that we've had, and also in our subcommittee, is Bill Mackey came and presented his analysis and assessment of the current zoning, and just how little available land there is under current zoning to build anything other than single family housing. I mean, multifamily housing. I mean, he basically said, essentially there's nowhere in the city no available land in the city to build multifamily housing, which, you know, whether or not that's exactly right, it's still, I think, a very dramatic illustration of kind of where we are with zoning. And where I'm going with that is, he also said, you know, the zoning that we currently have in the city is the most harmful to those least able to bear that harm, low income folks, persons with disabilities, right? The list goes on. So I just wonder if there is a way in this, in Plan Tucson, to highlight the equity issues related to zoning, and how the fact that, you know, the zoning that we currently have is really disadvantaging people who need housing most, and that it's contributing, essentially, you know, if you kind of draw that out, it's contributing to homelessness.
Yeah.
So again, you know, that's kind of maybe more of a value statement about zoning. But you know, it might be worth considering framing zoning in that way, because I don't know, it hadn't really occurred to me to think of it kind of in those terms until I heard Bill's presentation.
Yeah, Jay, that's interesting. And I think you're right. I think we're starting to, as we've been working at just kind of justifying and really understanding kind of what zoning code changes we need and how we try really adjust, or how we address a lot of these issues. I think looking at the equity issues related to it is really important, because, you know, every time a housing project dies, or even looking at, like, and I'll show this in a second in the CCT portion when I talk about it, but looking at, you know, the steps that people have to go through in order to get, you know, the number of units they need to make a project work. You know, a lot of times they end up, you know, settling on something that is fewer units, or they end up with just luxury apartments or something of that sort, and it just doesn't meet the needs of the community. And I think, and on top of that, if we continue to utilize our current zoning, which is not functioning properly, it makes things worse and worse over time. So it continues to increase cost because we're not getting the actual production that we need. And you were right earlier, where you're like, I mean, we rely on market rate housing, and we rely on the private sector to build most of our housing. We don't have the money to effectively subsidize our way out of this mess. And so if we don't make those changes, things continue to get worse and worse and worse over time.
And I think too, and you know, Kenny has raised this point a number of times in this subcommittee meeting and at CEHD as well, like, you know, how we talk about this and how we frame it really does matter. And I just think about, you know, zoning, I think, is a good example where, you know, I don't think people often associate it with equity issues, or maybe even homelessness for that matter. But, you know, if it can be framed a little bit differently, I think it provides some ammunition to fight back against NIMBYism, because, you know, even with the current housing crisis, you know, it's still every little thing that comes up that is, you know, requesting a zoning change or a project coming online, or, I mean, people show up and they don't want it. And I just, you know, I think part of it that will always just be part of what has to be dealt with. But I do think that, you know, shifting the framework a little bit to, you know, push back and say, you know, we're doing this because it's an equity issue. You know, we've heard about, you know, homelessness is everybody's talking about homelessness one way or the other, and this is a way to address it. So again, just, you know, I don't know if that can be done this late in the game, or if that's even appropriate for Plan Tucson, but I do think, you know, again, to kind of Kenny's point, over the past several months, the framing and the way we talk about it matters.
Great. Okay.
That was actually one more thing. Sorry, Dan.
No worries.
I was just wondering, you know, looking at this map, it's, you know, this Midtown Tucson and a little bit, you know, on the sides, but then you know, the Southlands is there all grayed out. And, you know, that's one of the like biggest areas for growth within the city of Tucson, but like it's grayed out. Like what's the zoning, like what's going on there? I mean, I don't know. It seems a little strange that, you know, that's going to be the, you know, future growth area over the next 50 years yet. It's like behind a curtain.
Yeah, it's so basically I think the goal is that, and the reason why it's kind of grayed out is because that is basically areas that will likely be sold off by state lands, and it'll likely be master planned. And so I think the goal here is to provide enough of a framework so that it's relatively like smartly done, but also enough flexibility so then when those proposals come in, they can kind of adapt to what the needs are of the market and of the community at those times. So it's you know, it's 10, 20 years out. So I think it's going to probably require some more specific planning in the future.
Yeah, because that, you know, the zoning there is just so critical, like we're talking about, right? If we don't lay the foundation now for what that should be, you know, we're going to end up with the same problems or different problems that we couldn't foresee, you know, 50 years ago. Because if it's all going to be, you know, basically like what's out in Vale and, you know, out on the east side that's being developed now, I mean, we're we're going to be in a
Yeah.
worse situation than we are now, you know. So anyway, maybe something to talk about at another time.
Yeah, no, but you're absolutely correct, and I think that's, you know, it's a tough one because I think that we don't necessarily want to end up with a whole bunch of general plan amendments as we move forward, but we also don't want to just leave it so wide open that you're right that we end up with, you know, another situation like we have out in either Vale or we have along Houghton in a lot of senses too,
Yep.
where a lot of that development isn't, you know, it's typical kind of, you know, kind of suburban development that
Yep.
that isn't really reflective of a lot of our values, essentially.
Right.
Cool. All right. Just to point out, Chapter 5 has tools for implementation. We've met with different departments in order to kind of put in some projects that are short, near, mid, and long term. And then essentially you'll see some of the zoning reform stuff that we talked about. There are those projects that are being listed in there. So our corridors tool is in near term, as well as changes to kind of middle housing regulations, which is being pushed by the state through House Bill 2721. But will right now, as you may or may not know, we're working with the Drockman Institute and Bill Mackey on doing some initial analysis of kind of what some of those changes could be moving forward. I have a feeling we're going to provide options to mayor and council on either doing it strictly on the letter of the law or looking at it to something that actually is more supportive of the community as a whole, to where it could be, you know, different geographic areas of the city. It could be potentially, you know, large portions of the city. Okay, and then basically just ways to kind of continue to engage. We're going to be collecting feedback up until the 31st of January, so another 10 days or so. We you know, we have the feedback forums ended, I think, on Thursday. We've held 7 of those. You can host your own meeting if you have a group that you want to bring this. We have all these meeting in the box materials that you can bring, and it'll kind of guide you through providing feedback. And then we have our online surveys as well. So please feel free to fill those out. Feel free to send comments to myself or Cesar or the team at Plan Tucson AZ, Tucson at tucsonaz.gov to provide that feedback. But a lot of the comments I appreciate that you provided here. I'll make sure to come back to the team and we'll talk a bit about how we can potentially clarify some of those things and really kind of frame that argument or frame the section in a certain way as we move forward. And then this is kind of the next steps on how we're moving forward. Our second planning commission meeting, we're looking at a study session on February 5th. We are looking at planning commission public hearings. So the state law requires at least 2 public hearings for this in 2 different locations. We're looking at least 2. Previously they did 5, but because we're going to be holding them hybrid, we think that that should be okay, but there may be additional ones if the commission wants to, have some additional public hearings. We're going to do a call to the election on April 2025. Make sure we get it on the ballot, and then public hearing and review with the mayor and council in May, and then we'll get into informational mode, trying to get the word out as much as possible. Educating people on what's in the plan for the election in November 2025. Any other comments or questions related to Plan Tucson? Okay, I don't know if there's a separate agenda item for the CCT or Community Corridors tool, but I can either jump into that or I can wait until we're ready.
There is no separate agenda.
Okay, cool. Oh, Jay, you're muted.
Can that not just be part of the Plan Tucson discussion?
Yeah, I think it can be. So
Yeah,
I will.
I'm cool with moving forward with it if everybody else is.
Okay, cool. Excellent. So yeah, so Community Corridors tool. This is something again that we've been working on really for almost 2 years at this point. I wanted to provide an update and kind of how this may kind of, its implications on just housing in general in the city of Tucson. And so really just its goals here are to make infill development, especially affordable housing, easier to build along our corridors. We have on here remove barriers to attainable housing. So maybe attainable is better than accessible housing or housing accessibility. Promote transit-oriented infill development and pedestrian-oriented development that supports our climate action goals. We want to really update our zoning to make it so we can permit a full spectrum of housing types. So as I was talking before, instead of just what our code right now really does well is the small stuff. And then if you can actually rezone things, the larger buildings you can probably do, but the stuff in between, not so much. Look to simplify redevelopment of underutilized and vacant sites in the city of Tucson, especially parking lots and parking that's unused parking. And then that last one's increased flexibility for electric vehicle supply equipment. That's something that mayor and council wanted us to look at, and we ended up adding it into this. So it comes from a lot of mayor and council direction over the last couple of years, starting all the way back in February 22nd, where we had a study session on recommendations from the Commission on Equitable Housing and Development for zoning code related changes specifically related to affordable housing. We held an April 18th study session on tools for redevelopment underutilized sites that's looking at declining commercial areas as well as just large vacant parking lots and how we can get those to redevelop. We had another one on zoning code regulations for tiny homes. That was like everything related to tiny homes, but there's a portion of this that kind of does address portions of that. I mean, that was a conversation where it was looking at, kind of what you traditionally think of as a tiny home, like a 200 square foot tiny home, shelter care units, all the way up to like just small homes that are like 800 square feet. Brought all of that together, had a study session with them, and had a work plan. They said, go forward. Then we really spent about 8 months doing analysis, running opportunity site scenarios throughout the city, really understanding what the barriers are to development. We also did quite a bit of market analysis to really understand, what do we need in order to get, people to develop. And then we briefed them back in September and October as well. As we've moved forward, we've kind of continuing to keep them in the loop. So what we're trying to do here is really, allow for kind of flexibility in the development, but also in doing so, something that does these things. It allows for diverse housing types, requires transitions in form and scale, it regulates parking location and access, but it doesn't regulate the amount. So you basically can provide a statement saying how much you would need to provide as far as parking goes, but you can't locate it like all in front of your building next to, along the corridor to where it creates a huge kind of, heat island essentially. Create human scale blocks. So again, things that are, again, related to transit-oriented, pedestrian-oriented development versus this auto-centric development that we're really getting from our current suburban code. We want to create walkable streets and ultimately just encourage resilient and livable places in Tucson. This is where it is we're proposing. It's essentially an optional tool that can apply to sites that have frontage along our corridors. We have on here R1 and R2. They're allowed in pretty limited cases. It's when there's either a vacant lot or it's either between two commercial spaces on an arterial, or it's like kind of a split zone lot where you have a full site and part of it's residential. I'll show you an example here in a second of one that we have with MH2, I believe. Permitted uses, you're not allowed to use this to develop kind of auto-centric uses. So no drive-throughs, no self-storage, no car washes, no smoke shops. It's really intended to be community supportive uses. And then there are some additional housing types that we allow for: townhomes, duplexes, tiny homes, etc. Dimensional standards, encourage to provide more housing, removing the density caps, allowing for an additional story or two. What we found is that in order for a project to really work, you need 4 stories, essentially. Like we did a full analysis of our market right now, and the one thing that really works is a 4-story double loaded corridor building. And under our current code, you'd need C3 in order to do that. And so understanding that there's very few places in the city currently that can actually, you can build something that works financially feasible. Incentives and bonuses allow for, we have incentives for more height if you provide affordable housing, if you allow for first floor commercial uses, or if you preserve historic properties on site. So understanding that increases cost, especially for historic properties. That was actually interesting in our survey. The most supportive incentive, even more so than affordable housing, which was very strange to me, but that's, I guess shows how important historic preservation is to Tucsonans. And then development standards. I talked about the flexibility for parking, but we do require a master plan for larger sites. We have it set in the code right now as 15. I think we might move that down to 12 after doing some analysis. But basically larger sites, making sure that they have a master plan to make sure that it does meet the intent of the tool, that it's walkable, it has blocks, that it has that connectivity that you really want with that type of development. There was a lot of concern about something like Park Place coming in or Elcon coming in, developing, and then also basically just doing it piecemeal and it never really working together. If you actually look at the bridges, or you look at the landing that's over on I-19 in Irvington, I think those are examples of kind of missed opportunities in the city of Tucson, to where those are large sites that were master planned, but they're not walkable. They're not it's not really meeting the goals and the ideals that we've set out in a lot of our policy documents. So wanted to talk a little bit about the housing needs assessment that we have, that we recently did for State Bill 1162. So just a really close kind of a quick kind of thing is that basically 8,747 housing units are needed in Tucson just to address our current need. So understanding that that's homelessness and underproduction, half of that's kind of underproduction. It's about half right now. So we really are just not producing enough for the needs of our community. When you look at the next 10 years, we need over 35,000 housing units when factoring in current need, underproduction, and future need. Oh yeah, Ray, go ahead.
I'm wondering about the vacancy rate and if that isn't taken into consideration at all when determining the need.
I don't know how they actually incorporated the vacancy rate, but I can definitely look at that and follow back up on how that works and how that is. But yeah, no, that's a really good comment. So what's kind of interesting about this, at least from what we've seen, is that this is kind of how it's distributed as far as our need over the next 10 years. And so what you see here is really 2/3 of our housing need over the next 10 years is subsidized, is like the subsidized affordable housing. So 0 to 30% area median income, and then 30 to 60% area median income. And so understanding that there's a huge need for, the capital A, the affordable housing, subsidized affordable housing in the city of Tucson. What's also kind of interesting in this is that almost all of our future need that we have over the next 10 years that's not part of that subsidized portion is in greater than 120% area median income. So it's market rate housing and up, essentially. And what we're seeing is, and this is a reflection of what we're seeing with in-migration, and a lot of people coming from markets with higher purchasing power, or they sell a house for a lot more money or whatever, or they make more money, is that they're coming into the market and we don't have the housing supply that they're looking for a lot of times. And so instead of coming in and purchase and having a house that may be upgraded or whatever, they're now going through, and if they don't have the actual house for themselves or the home here, they'll go through and rent something here and just upgrade it. And it's pulling those units off of the market for people who normally would have those units available for them for affordability. So our inability to continue to produce market rate housing is starting to erode these kind of middle sections as well, as far as some of that, as Jay was saying, the naturally affordable or occurring affordable housing.
I just gotta jump in here, Dan, and I mean, again, just the conventional wisdom that is developed around what kind of housing crisis we have versus what I think the reality of the statistics shows, that I'm afraid it's just going to be like this forever. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at this, I would argue that there's not really much missing middle housing. What's the problem is that we can't build it for poor people, and that's going to continue to be a huge problem with absolutely no solution in sight, right? If it's not going to be more subsidized and developers aren't going to build it, which they don't or can't or whatever, then we really need to be focused on that part of what's going on, because everybody knows that if we tweak the zoning code and do some of the things I think that the city is doing, those 11,738 housing units, those are going to get built, right? I mean, the market will produce those, but I just don't see under any circumstances going forward how those 0 to 30 and 30 to 60 units are going to get built. And we need to be honest with ourselves and with this community that that's the reality. And if we don't get more funding from the federal government, maybe the state, like that number is just not going to change. I mean, that's my opinion after, sitting in on a million of these different meetings and whatnot. And until somebody can give me something different to change my opinion, I just think that that's where we are. And again, I don't know where this fits into this tool or, Plan Tucson or whatever, but I just go back to, I think why people think it's a housing crisis is because now there's some middle-class folks that are struggling a little more than they used to afford housing, which is an issue. Obviously, we need to deal with it, but like, there's nothing we're doing, in my opinion, that's really addressing the 20,000 units that are going to be needed here. So take that for what it's worth, but that's my opinion. And I just don't think that message comes across when we're having many of these conversations.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jay. And I mean, when I looked at this, it was really upsetting for me. I mean, like I don't know how you produce that many subsidized units. I mean, there's just,
It's not possible. I mean,
it's
under
not-
the
it's not.
current regime, it's literally not possible. It's not.
Yeah.
So,
Allison?
I just want to jump in because I can't help it. But Jay, I like obviously agree with everything that you're saying, and I think the point here with the CCT is a both and perspective is right. We have seen in cities that have expanded zoning opportunity to build housing. We've sort of stemmed the tide in terms of rising housing costs. So that's a big part of affordability, is just like trying to kind of keep things in line with where they are, and not see the huge jump that we saw in recent years. And then, right, like really building in like this also, it helps the affordable housing development because those same zoning issues are issues for affordable housing developers, and sort of giving them more land that like subsidized housing can be developed in kind of helps on that trend. Again, don't disagree with anything you're saying at all either.
yeah, no, I think it's a really important point. It's like, I don't want to be heard as like poo-pooing all of the good things I think that the city is doing to get more kinds of housing built, but like, let's not fool ourselves. Poor people are going to struggle in this community now, and they're going to struggle later because we're unable to build that kind of housing. And I think there's this idea that the city of Tucson is going to do these things to change zoning and, you know, all the great things we're talking about, and that it's going to make affordable housing and equitable housing a reality. And I just think we need to be honest that that's not going to happen, or that's just my viewpoint. And I think people get confused and wonder why no affordable housing gets built, and they blame the city. And I'm like, it's not the city's fault. It's just not the city's fault. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox and we can move on. Sorry.
I will say that while I, you know, again, I agree with a lot of that, and I think we've tried to frame it in a way that where we, you know, we're trying to address overall kind of affordability for people, not necessarily that all of this will lead to, you know, kind of subsidized affordable housing or whatever, and actually fix the problem. It's one tool of many that we need to utilize in order to try to address some of this stuff. But I think that if we don't address this portion as well for the future need, it causes additional problems within our community
Sure.
as well. And I think that's something that does need to be we need to be pretty clear about.
Yeah. Good, Kenny.
Yeah, I'm curious, with these kind of two sets, you know, different ends of the graph here. Does the city have an idea of the zoning capacity that's available at the moment?
Yeah, so that's kind of what we did with Plan Tucson, was looking at by right zoning, and then looking at kind of potential rezonings. And really, we don't, I mean, you can probably redevelop some of our commercial zones, but the barriers that are built into our commercial zones right now don't match what the market will produce. And I know that a lot of what's going on as well is that, and Allison spoke a little bit to this, is that there are barriers for us with like when we're going through and trying to develop our subsidized housing within our zoning code as well. And so we don't get there with the current zoning code. We need zoning reform in order to get to where we need to be.
I guess I'm curious, just like order of magnitude, where that stacks up against, you know, like 11,000 or 13,000.
Yeah, I think it's potentially like when we do start to do a build out scenario, I think we get maybe halfway there over the next 10 years without zoning code reforms. But that's some of our analysis that we've done. It could be lower, it could be higher. I have a feeling it's actually lower related to that, because we're not seeing many people redevelop with really much multifamily outside of our overlays in downtown and our pads. I would say, I think over easily over half is in our overlays, which is like less than 5% of our area in the city. And then probably 2/3 of the multifamily development that's been developed outside of our overlays has been done in pads, either in the bridges, in the landing, or kind of there's another pad on the east side. So the one thing I do want to point out here is just, and this is going back to that affordable housing developers have the same zoning constraints that market rate developers do. And so this is, you know, the team for Amazon Flats came from HCD and did a pre-sub with our zoning department and basically looked at the base zoning, how many units they can get, and then also looked at potentially using the proposal for the community corridors tool. And this shows really the impact it could potentially have, right? So really, because of parking standards, because of some setbacks, and also because it's a split zone site, there's this MH1 portion, they really can only get an additional 30 units without rezoning on the site. The height limit is 40, but they could really only do 2 stories, again, mostly because of parking. And so looking at the CCT option, because they're able to use more height, they're able to kind of use that split zone portion differently, and then also use that affordable housing incentive. They can potentially get, you know, 124 units on site. I think they only are proposing 84 new units on here, but they could even get more, but they didn't really need that many to make it work. So this kind of just shows you an example of why this type of tool is important, not only for market rate, but for the subsidized. Again, I don't, you know, whether the tool or not gets us to that huge number that we need, it does start to help with some of that at the very least. It keeps them from having to go through a rezoning, which requires, again, it's people come out and fight any project that's going to be next to them, and it makes it really, really challenging, and then increased time, and especially if you're looking for LIHTC, if you're looking for the low-income housing tax credits, the timing on that's really, really important. And if you have to go through a full rezoning related to that, in a lot of senses, it's not even possible. So that's kind of, you know, what we're looking at as far as just kind of some of the reasons why I think, you know, this tool is helpful. Again, it doesn't get at everything, but I think it could be very helpful moving forward. One of the reasons as well, just related to equity issues and things of that sort, one of the reasons we're saying that it applies citywide is because some of the more recent research that we've seen is that when you do kind of targeted upzoning or targeted overlays, that it leads to a lot of displacement and significant increases in costs and gentrification. And we're trying to mitigate against that by actually allowing for this citywide and doing it that way. And that's part of the reason why I know we've had some comments, well, you should pilot it, you should do this, but that's part of the reasons why we're not necessarily doing that. And a lot of this stuff we have learned from our overlays as far as how it functions. Little bit about just kind of how we got here. Community engagement. We kind of learned from all of our policies in phase 1 and held some focus groups. And then we've really been doing a lot of public outreach in phase 2 since August. Held public meetings, had a public preference survey. We had an online survey of goals and strategies. We held more public meetings in October and November. We've had a survey, emails. We're doing office hours this week and next week with the community members where they can come in and talk to us as well. The major concerns right now are kind of related to impacts on neighborhoods and lack of notification. There's a big push to have kind of I don't know if it's a full like rezoning process, but having notification of the surrounding areas for when there's a project that wants to utilize the tool. There's concern about just the fact that we're allowing for it on materials and collectors. So we're going to clarify kind of through our maps how that looks. There's limited applicability on our collectors because a lot of them are already zoned R1 and R2 and are built out. And then transitions, and if they're adequate, as far as just bulk reduction as you get towards existing neighborhoods and make sure that it's contextually sensitive. There have been talks about design review. There's not a lot of predictability in design review for either the community or the actual developer. So we're hoping to just use form standards to mitigate some of that lack of predictability that comes from design review. There were concerns about infrastructure and whether or not our city can handle additional density. Generally, developers are often required to build infrastructure for their project if they don't meet it. So if you need to have more wastewater capacity, you need to have more traffic capacity, et cetera, you have to provide that. They pay impact fees. Generally, dense development is better for just efficiency of a city and efficiency of services. And then there've just been some concerns about kind of community engagement and whether or not we're incorporating a lot of the feedback we've received. Did host a planning commission meeting on the 18th.
Hey, Dan,
yeah.
just want to flag, we are quite a bit over, so I don't know.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I will.
Not your fault. I've been taking up a lot of the airspace. So if we could move through as quickly as possible.
Yep, I will do this very quickly. So we held a planning commission meeting. It was really good feedback. We're going to be back with them in January. Had some concerns about just kind of what's a corridor, where's it work, how does parking statement work, and so we're going through and just kind of doing analysis and going to be posting materials hopefully later today related to this, kind of addressing the concerns from the commission and the comments. We're updating our frequently asked questions right now for the community. There's a lot of them. It's like 30 pages. So we're trying to group them and make it so it's easier to navigate. We're quality checking, and then we're hosting some open houses with individual community members where they can come and ask clarifying questions, provide feedback to us kind of on an individual basis. So, 2 or 3 people, they can just sit down with staff and be able to do that. We have 24 slots that are available over the next week or so for that. And this is kind of the timeline moving forward. So yeah, planning commission next week, and then hopefully public hearing in February with a tentative date of March. Part of the reason why we're shooting for the March date is because that Amazon Flats application is due April 1st. And if possible, we'd like to have the CCT in place so they can use that as their zoning for the project. Any questions?
Looks like we're good. Cool.
Excellent. Thank you all. I'll provide the slides for everyone. There's a lot more information related to CCT on the website. It can get kind of complex, but yeah, no, I really appreciate the conversation and the feedback.
Thanks, Dan. Next month, we'll have you back to present your housing utopia plan that I know didn't get a chance to cover today. So we'll be looking forward to that.
Sounds good. That's exciting.
All right. Thanks, Dan.
Right. Thanks, guys. Bye.
All right. We are behind, but hopefully that was good for everybody. Definitely a great presentation. Allison, Neto, HCD, is there anything else that you guys need to update us about?
So we do have that presentation on some details about Prop 414, which I know we're now pretty short on time. I feel like I could do the speed version in 5 minutes if you wanted me to.
So let me ask, particularly, I think, Ray, number 1 on the agenda for item number 6 is the mobile home working group, and I want to make sure we have time for that. And I know also you had some questions, as do I, about Prop 414. So I guess I just want to take your temperature and see what order makes sense. Like, do you want to spend time on 414 or get to the working group, or what's your pleasure?
I'd love to talk about 414. I think the mobile home park even could just be a couple minutes, and could be a further conversation in the future. But I'm happy to talk about 414.
Perfect. Take it away, Allison.
All right. And I think I will still try to do the shortened version, but feel free to stop me as we go. Let's see. Share. Okay. Does that look okay to everybody? Okay. So a little bit of background, if you all remember, Lane Mandel came to the December full commission meeting to talk about Prop 414 as a whole, and there were some questions from the commission about how many units are we talking about with the different housing components. So staff has been working on compiling some of that data and wanted to make sure you all were aware, because both relates to kind of mission of CEHD, and the commission would potentially have a role in a couple of these elements as well. So I want to make sure you all have the information you feel like you need to be informed on this proposition. So just to start with, though, we did get some clarification from the city manager, or not the city attorney, just in terms of the commission's role here. So just to make sure we're all on the same page before we start, you are a commission of the city, and so therefore the commission itself can't take a position on the ballot measure. We can't in this meeting or other commission meetings discuss any of your individual positions on the ballot initiative. You can ask questions, seek clarity, and provide and share information that is neutral and not advocacy. And then as individuals outside of the commission meetings, just like as an individual, me as a city staff, not on my working time, I and you all can take a position on the ballot measure and share information if asked in the community. Yeah, Ray?
I'm wondering with that, like if we were to write an op-ed or something, can we say as part of like who we are that we're on the commission, not that we're speaking for the commission, but that we're on it?
That's a good question. I feel like I would want to just clarify with the city attorney, and I'm happy to do that. Yeah, I think definitely not not speaking on behalf of the commission, but that's a good question, just indicating your areas of expertise that you do also sit on this commission. I can get that clarification, Ray. And so just some background, if you ever want any more information on the proposition, it's on this website, tucsonaz.gov/prop414. I'm just going to focus on the affordable housing and shelter component, and maybe a little bit on the neighborhood and community resilience areas, since those are kind of the areas both the HCD would work on and the commission would as well. So all dollar amounts in these slides are based on an estimated $80 million per year tax collection. But if those come in or over that amount, those amounts would be allocated proportionately. And then the estimates that I have in here of impact are very much approximations based on what we're currently doing with similar funding. And then if approved by voters, there would be a citizen tax oversight commission that would oversee all of these activities. So throughout the slides, I'm sort of highlighting a few of what I think are included in CEHD priorities. So with these icons, so the one icon is if CEHD has a specific role working on an item. Another is if it's advancing prosperity initiative policies. And then third, if it's advancing policy priorities laid out in the housing affordability strategy for Tucson. And so just thinking about prosperity initiative alignment, I'd have to spend a lot more time doing a full crosswalk, but you can kind of see here with the check marks that there are elements in the Safe and Vibrant Cities initiative that really touch on a lot of the different pieces of the prosperity initiative. So looking at the affordable housing and shelter, that's estimated to generate about $14 million per year, or $140 million total. And so we think, just based again on that back of the napkin calculation, that with that funding, we would see about 7,000 units of affordable housing developed or preserved. And you can kind of check my math as we go through what that is based on. So the first is a gap financing pool. Which we currently have one. This would add additional funding on top of that. We currently have home funding. This year, we're looking at allocating about $2 million per year. That helps us fund 2 to 3 LIHTC developments, averaging 75 units. So based on that math, we think we could do 2,000 to 3,000 units over 10 years. The sort of additional caveat here with the sales tax is that we would have additional flexibility that isn't as possible using federal funds. So we could start thinking more about funding alternative projects like things that aren't LIHTC, some smaller scale, missing middle, home ownership projects, things like that. As an impact, the second item is an impact fee waiver. So again, we currently do this. We've allocated in the sort of past fiscal year about $500,000 from our general fund. That funding is kind of subject to budget availability. And, you know, kind of, so there's some uncertainty there in the general fund. So this would kind of create a dedicated funding pot for that and increase the funding pot. So with that increased funding pot, we could likely see about 110 units per year or 3,400 over 10 years. Those are the projects that we have funded in FY24 with impact fees. So you can see some LIHTC, some not. Kind of gives us some more flexibility there as well. Definition of resilience in housing. The next 3 items will speak to kind of resilience in housing. And when we were thinking about what does resilience related to housing mean, it's right, the ability to adapt to change positively. And so that we think a lot in terms of climate resilience right now. And so we think of that as one piece. But also we're thinking about resilience to rising housing prices or impacts of deferred maintenance as well. And so we're trying to think a little bit more holistically about what housing resilience is. So city-owned housing stock, we currently own about 2,000 units of housing, public housing in El Portal. This would help improve and those units with water efficiency, weatherization, things like that. We know that the funding from the federal government is not keeping pace with maintenance needs. Overall, we serve 3,000 extremely low income folks in this program with an annual income of about $12,000. We think we'd be able to, there's variability here, right? Some units need like $2,000 worth of work and some need $50,000 worth of work. So kind of on average, thinking about $20,000 per unit, looking at about 1,000 units over 10 years that we'd be able to preserve, right?
How much of this is related to, this is not the same as any of the public housing, right? The scattered sites public housing, that's completely separate. This is city owned versus.
So the scattered sites that we have been talking about in CEHD are part of our public housing portfolio.
Okay, I mean, those are city owned housing
Yes.
stock.
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
with this initiative then preserve some of those and not have them sold off?
Yeah, so currently we went to Mayor and Council this fall and identified the like 200 plus, I think, scattered site units that we definitely are wanting to keep. So those units we are definitely keeping. We're still working on kind of the plan for the other scattered site units, whether those, and I think, is that the next item? No, okay. We're working on the plan for kind of what those scattered site units, what will happen to those, either selling them off, kind of long-term permanently affordable housing trust type of situation. But we are keeping at least 200 of those scattered site units.
But the sales tax then wouldn't help preserve additional ones. Like you wouldn't sell fewer of them because of Prop 414.
So I'll try to highlight that, and I think we're going to get to another component that would help there.
Great, thanks.
Okay, resiliency for home ownership. So we have a current home repair program through CDBG. That funding kind of with all of our federal sources, home, CDBG, is uncertain in the future. We've seen even in prior administrations that funding being threatened, but sort of using that as a template, we think we could improve 400 to 600 homes in 10 years. Renters, we don't currently have a program that will help us preserve and enhance existing kind of affordable and workforce rental housing with these same types of improvements. But based on a program in Phoenix and estimating about $25,000 per unit, we think we could improve 400 units over 10 years. This would have CHD would have a role in this, kind of recommending projects. Down payment assistance, we do offer down payment assistance, again, through a uncertain federal source, but with the funding proposed here, would be able to provide to an additional 66 home buyers. Asset repositioning, so kind of what Ray is referring to, this would help us kind of renovate and modernize some of the units that we likely as a city will not maintain ownership of, but renovate those for permanent affordable home ownership, like through the city or through partners. So that's kind of the idea there. They might still be sold to partners like the land trust, but this would kind of give us a pot of money to update those homes so they are ready to sell and be a resource to a family that needs it. So we think that would be about 100 homes total. So does that answer your question, Ray? Okay. Low barrier shelter development and operations. We know there's a huge gap in low barrier shelter in the city, and what we've been able to develop through the Housing First program is really important in filling that gap, but the current funding is time limited through grants. And so through kind of more long-term funding, we're able to serve 250 people per year, 70% of which enter permanent housing after going through our programs. The Housing First program as a whole, this is sort of additional funding to expand the program. Some of the services that are offered are the encampment assessment, street outreach, mobile shower program, volunteer engagement, emergency shelters, housing navigation, and supportive housing. Right now, across all of these programs, we serve 1,300 individuals, with 70% again going on to permanent housing. Community safety, the community safety, health, and wellness staff provide a lot of housing coordination help. Again, working in coordination with the Housing First program. So 2,700 people per year, 60% of whom are receiving housing and shelter services. So this would be funding for 10 behavioral health and social work experts to staff those calls and help navigate folks through the community. Okay, I'm gonna stop there because I know you only have 5 minutes. The other thing that I want to highlight on this is the Thrive Zone investments, and I think you all have a decent idea of what Thrive Zones are.
Thanks so much, Allison. That's a great presentation. Any questions, Ray or Kenny?
Yeah, I guess I'm still like, all really important initiatives for the proposition to fund, and just kind of hung up on the percentage categories of if there are surplus over the years, that's the way the percentages get calculated and fixed, that's kind of saying no matter how much if the sales tax intake might be, that it's still a really small portion of that going to housing. So I don't know. I think, is there anything that can be done with some of the categorization of the different categories around the sales tax? On the one hand, it's enshrining really, in my eyes, like a smaller percentage for housing, and then perhaps ongoing capital needs are like once, right? ongoing sources of funding for capital needs that by definition are one-time purchase or improvements.
That's a good question, Kenny, and I can try to get a more an answer that I feel like I understand better in terms of the whether the percentages are fixed overall. When yeah, I think some of the elements are like a one-time purchase as opposed to other categories.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the full commission discussion, it sounded like, you know, the things are what they are. But once those, at least the broad categories are approved, that, you know, would take a vote or whatnot to change those. So it seems, you know, in my mind, like it could be a good strategy, right? To make sure that as funding continues or as the sales tax, if it does well, we want that funding to go where it can be really impactful.
Sure. Okay.
My question is around alternatives to a sales tax too. I know there was talk for a while about a housing bond, and wondering if the city is also pursuing that, both because it's a much less regressive tax and also something that was specific and only dedicated to housing.
Yeah, so the one kind of piece that I know Lane shared that I actually hadn't ever actually known is right, that the sales tax can fund services, whereas a bond can only fund kind of capital improvements. So I think question and conversation about bond and thinking about that with the county and in partnership with the county is, I think, still ongoing. But I think you know, Jim has mentioned that at previous meetings. But this initiative, right, does allow us some additional flexibility that a bond wouldn't. That mainly being, right, like things like the Housing First programming, the community safety, health and wellness programming, that wouldn't be feasible via a bond initiative.
I have also heard people say that the potential of a housing bond with the city and the county is low right now for various reasons, and that I don't know if that's just kind of the scuttlebutt because this is on the table now, and there's a kind of a downplaying of the possibility of a bond for, you know, various different reasons. But that's just kind of what I've heard, that like a bond is really not on the table for different reasons. So whatever that's worth. Anything else, Ray or Kenny?
I tried to be short.
Yeah. Say one last question. I know there's a lot of opposition to this, honestly, is from all kinds of sides and for all kinds of reasons. I'm wondering what the timeline would be like if this is voted down, but people still, like, the city still needs funding, of what the process would be of doing one again. Like how
Sure,
long
yeah, I don't know the answers to kind of any to the plan B timeline. Jim asked a similar question in the affordable housing subcommittee, and more along the lines of like, where would we be if this gets voted down? And I sort of said we'd be where we are right now, which is we have a funding cliff for some of our really important programs that are evidence-based now. We have kind of uncertain federal funding coming down, and we would obviously continue to be applying for grants and being creative and flexible with what we're doing now. But yeah, I don't know kind of any timeline or anything about the plan B.
Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Allison. Great presentation. With that, I know we are at 2:30. Kenny and Ray, are y'all able to hang on for a few more minutes? Okay. I'd like to move on to agenda item number 6 at this point. Obviously, we don't have a much time at all to deal with this, but Ray, I did want to give a little bit of time to at least tee up the mobile home working group and the potential of this subcommittee supporting that or housing it, whatever the case may be. Obviously, we can talk about it more at our next subcommittee meeting, but the floor is yours.
Thank you. So you remember at the last meeting about proposing a working group that would also include members from the county commission. So still working on getting some members there and ensuring that all members from the city commission were invited, since I think not everyone was at that meeting. It does seem like the Equitable Housing Strategies Committee is very related to ensuring that equity is there for, can you hear me okay? Do you want me to put my headset on? Okay. To ensure that there's equity for issues affecting people in mobile homes. Yeah, I wonder what collaboration might look like.
I mean, my opinion is just that, obviously the issues related to mobile homes and mobile home parks and manufactured housing, land squarely in the realm of, housing equity. And I would just say, whatever way that this subcommittee can support that working group is kind of what I would like to do. And so I'm really open, Ray, to what you think is the best way that could happen. So whether that's like housing the working group here or provide, I don't even know what the possibilities are, but it's such an important piece of the housing puzzle that I just wanted to be open to kind of whatever would work best to support the working group.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
You have any thoughts, Kenny?
Yeah, just I think it's important work, clearly. I think my just having a hard time scheduling a lot of meetings, so I think if that's I support, if some of that work comes in here, I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I think and there may be more, specific or knottier issues to work through. So it also makes sense to me if that, you all need to meet or work through things separately, that supportive of that as well.
Jay, do you have any capacity for another meeting?
Yeah, of course. More meetings. I have infinite capacity for meetings.
I'm wondering if you were able to be on that working group. And then I will probably step back from coming to this meeting every month, but to be able to come once in a while, and we're like, okay, we're going to bring a topic specifically to the meeting and have it on the agenda. But if you were able to be part of that bridge too, I think that would be really powerful in keeping that work connected.
For sure. And another issue that we need to deal with is that you bring up, Ray, is Lori now has a conflict with this meeting time. And I know that it wasn't that long ago that we changed this meeting time. I'm hesitant to do it again, but I also don't want to lose Lori on the subcommittee. And I also think that, Vicky hasn't attended in a while. And then, Ray, if you can only come part of the time, my main thing is making sure we have a quorum. So I think we need to be judicious about who's an actual member of the subcommittee, because non-members of the subcommittee can come and hang out at the meeting and participate and do the whole thing. It's just for quorum, I need to be conscious about that. So again, no, we don't really have time to talk about that today, but obviously something to think about going forward. So yeah, if there's nothing more today to talk about the mobile home working group, happy to talk about it a little bit more, but also just want to be conscious of time a little bit. So I don't know, Ray, if there's anything else regarding the mobile home working group to discuss at this point.
Maybe just in terms of your scheduling question, I wonder about checking in with each person, right? Because there's some people who are on the list who very rarely come.
Yep.
It'd be a good moment for a check-in, and then could think about how we arrange the meeting times and try to coordinate those two working group times, or the subcommittee and the working group, so that they're not in conflict with each other.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. Definitely something that we need to do. So I'll try it over the next couple of weeks to check in with folks and just stay connected with you, Ray, about how you're setting up the working group and like what the scheduling is looking like, and we can yeah, try and make it work as best we can with people's schedules and, all of the stuff, other stuff we've got going on. So
Thank you.
cool. Thanks, Ray. The only other thing that I want to do, just real quick before we basically close out the meeting, and again, thanks for sticking around for a few extra minutes, but at the next full commission meeting, we have front and center working with the facilitators. And again, just to keep it front and center in y'all's minds, what I would like to do is, with the help of the facilitators, really narrow down to a handful of issues that the commission is going to deal with for the year. And then I would like to slot those into the different subcommittees, even if they don't match up exactly, because I do think, we obviously have a little bit more time to work through some stuff in our subcommittees. And then kind of as we get towards the end of the year, or, when things mature, that we can kind of come back as a full commission and have some actual recommendations and whatnot for mayor and council that are more related to some of the equity issues that we've been talking about. So I'm just saying that so that's in your mind, and also just to continue to think about, like, if you're ranking your top 3 or 4 issues, particularly related to housing equity, what would those be? Just so that we can have that discussion with the facilitators at the next full commission meeting. Do y'all have any thoughts or comments about kind of that structure and process, both for the subcommittees and the full commission, moving forward for the year? It's fine if you don't.
And that sounds like a good plan, right? Coming to consensus of what we should be, what we're interested in, and finding the right place for it.
Yeah, because there's just obviously, like, we get in all these meetings and there's just so much to deal with. It's like I just think we've got to, like, pick a few things and, like, really sink our teeth into it. So thanks for that, Kenny. Any thoughts from you, Ray? If not, I can move on.
I think that sounds like a good plan. Thanks.
Okay. So yeah, item number 6 on our agenda is just like our work plan. It's kind of like the catch-all, so we can discuss what we need to discuss. Obviously, didn't have a ton of time for that today, but I think, as we move forward throughout the year, like I said, we'll have some more time for discussion. And with that, I'll move on to item number 7, which is the call to the audience. Is there anybody in the audience still at this point?
No, there is not, Jay.
Okay, I will move on to item number 8, next steps. The next meeting for us, I actually don't know. It's on my agenda. I don't think it's accurate. We will have a meeting in February, but I'm not sure off the top of my head when it is. And then also the full commission meeting. Does anybody need to know that information, or I feel like it's kind of on the calendar, so.
I have it.
Say what, Kenny? I'm sorry.
Oh no, just I have it on the 18th.
Okay, perfect. I took some notes from today's meeting, obviously to report out to the full commission. Any other thoughts, questions about next steps or anything else before we adjourn? All right. Seeing nothing else, we are adjourned. Thanks everybody for staying extra.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to see you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.